By 1943, the Japanese Empire had fortified hundreds of islands across the Pacific, turning them into floating fortresses of steel and concrete. They believed every inch of that oceanic empire would bleed the Americans dry. But then, the U.S. military did something no one in Tokyo had predicted. Instead of smashing headlong into every island, America's commanders, led by General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, began skipping them. They left Japanese garrisons stranded, isolated, and useless, cutting off their supplies and leaving them to rot in silence. This was the island-hopping strategy, a bold, ruthless, and utterly brilliant plan that turned Japan's strongest defenses into its greatest weakness. And it would shock the entire Japanese military, from the lowest infantryman to the most powerful admiral. After the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan's military machines swept across the Pacific like wildfire. They captured the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, building a massive perimeter that stretched thousands of miles. By early 1942, Japan's empire was the largest it had ever been, defended by a network of fortified islands and powerful naval bases. Tokyo believed these bastions would make an American comeback impossible. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, once warned, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, I have no confidence." And he was right. Because by 1943, America's industrial might had begun to awaken. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and landing craft poured out of shipyards at an astonishing pace. While Japan's factories struggled to replace their losses, the United States was outbuilding them 10-1. Still, even with superior numbers, the Pacific posed an impossible challenge. The ocean was vast. The Japanese held hundreds of islands, each fortified and ready for suicidal resistance. To conquer every one of them would take years and hundreds of thousands of lives. It was then that a radical idea began to take shape, an idea that would change the course of the Pacific War. The brainchild of America's top commanders, Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific and General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest, was simple in theory but revolutionary in execution. Don't fight for every island. Leapfrog past them. Strike only where it matters most. Instead of attacking Japan's strongholds head-on, they would bypass them, choosing only key islands that could serve as air bases and naval staging points for the next leap forward. Each captured island would become a stepping stone, bringing U.S. bombers and fleets closer and closer to Japan itself. The rest of the islands? They'd be left behind, their defenders cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and any hope of rescue. It was psychological warfare at its finest. And the Japanese military, locked in a doctrine of no retreat, no surrender, couldn't comprehend it. The testing ground came at Guadalcanal, a small, brutal island in the Solomon chain. In August 1942, U.S. Marines stormed ashore under withering fire. What followed was 6 months of savage fighting, jungle warfare, starvation, and unrelenting air raids. But when the dust settled, America had its first major victory in the Pacific. Guadalcanal proved that Japanese forces could be beaten, but it also proved something else. Each island victory came at a horrifying cost. The U.S. realized that continuing this way, one island after another, could drag the war on for a decade. So after Guadalcanal, American planners asked the unthinkable, what if we just skip the next one? The answer would set the Pacific ablaze. As 1943 dawned, American reconnaissance planes began photographing islands deep within Japanese territory. Analysts studied maps, currents, weather, and enemy positions, searching for weaknesses. They soon realized that not all islands were equal. Some were heavily fortified but strategically meaningless, while others, like the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, were perfectly placed for launching the next wave. And so, with precision and cold calculation, the United States drew a path, a chain of targets stretching from the South Pacific all the way to Japan's doorstep. The stage was set for a campaign that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. and leave Japan's proud military utterly baffled at how their empire was being unraveled, one skipped island at a time. By mid-1943, Japan's empire stretched farther than its supply lines could reach. From the jungles of New Guinea to the atolls of the Central Pacific, thousands of soldiers stood guard, but few realized just how vulnerable they truly were. The Imperial Japanese Navy had achieved one of the fastest territorial expansions in history. But it came at a cost: logistics. The Pacific Ocean was unimaginably vast, over 60 million square miles of water, dotted with tiny islands. Maintaining supply routes across this expanse required ships, fuel, and air cover, all of which Japan was running out of. Admiral Yamamoto had once warned Tokyo that Japan's military might could only last about 6 months before America's industrial power turned the tide. Now that prediction was coming true. Convoys carrying food, ammunition, and fuel were being intercepted by American submarines at alarming rates. Every island fortress Japan had built, once a symbol of strength, was slowly becoming a prison. By 1943, American forces had fully recovered from the shock of Pearl Harbor. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle were producing tanks, ships, and aircraft faster than the Axis could destroy them. For every Japanese aircraft carrier lost, America launched 2 new ones. For every zero built in Japan, America rolled out dozens of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers. In the Pacific, the Navy and Marine Corps began to coordinate with unprecedented efficiency. Carrier task forces prowled the ocean like floating cities of steel. Meanwhile, the Seabees, U.S. Navy construction battalions, built airstrips on captured islands in record time, turning them into unsinkable aircraft carriers. But while the Americans were learning and adapting, the Japanese command clung to outdated doctrines. They believed that courage and sacrifice could compensate for inferior firepower. To them, retreat was dishonor, and strategic withdrawal was unthinkable. This rigid mindset blinded them to what was coming next. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved a bold new approach. The Pacific War would be fought on 2 parallel fronts. In the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur would lead the campaign through New Guinea and the Philippines. In the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz would spearhead the drive across the vast ocean, capturing critical island chains like the Marshalls, Marianas, and Carolines. Their missions were different, but their goal was the same: Japan itself. MacArthur's route would cut off Japan's southern lifelines to oil and resources. Nimitz's route would provide the bases for B-29 bombers to strike the Japanese home islands. It was a pincer movement, slow, methodical, and devastating. And in this grand design, the concept of island hopping became the unifying strategy. Before a single soldier landed on a beach, American intelligence officers and codebreakers were already at work. Thanks to Operation Magic, the U.S. had broken key parts of Japan's naval codes. They knew where convoys were moving, which bases were heavily fortified, and which islands could be safely bypassed. Every potential invasion site was studied with chilling precision. Aerial reconnaissance, submarine patrols, and coast watchers on remote islands gathered data day and night. U.S. planners began marking islands as must-take or bypass. Must-take, islands with airfields or harbors that could support the next offensive. Bypass, islands with no strategic value or those already isolated by air and sea. It was cold, mathematical warfare, something Japan's leadership didn't expect from a nation they had mocked as soft and mechanical. They soon learned just how wrong that assumption was. The first real test of this new approach came in Operation Cartwheel, launched in mid-1943. Its goal, to neutralize the massive Japanese base at Rabaul, located on the island of New Britain. Rabaul was one of Japan's most heavily fortified strongholds, home to more than 100,000 troops, powerful air defenses, and a protected harbor filled with warships. A direct assault would have been suicidal. So instead, the Americans went around it. They captured smaller surrounding islands, New Georgia, Bougainville, and parts of New Guinea, and built airfields there. From these bases, Allied bombers pounded Rabaul day and night, cutting off its supplies and leaving its defenders trapped. By early 1944, Rabaul, once the pride of Japan's Pacific defense, was completely neutralized. No invasion had ever been necessary. This was the first major demonstration of island hopping's power. The Japanese high command was stunned. They couldn't understand how a fortress that hadn't fallen in battle had still been rendered useless. Scene 6. The enemy realizes too late. As reports poured into Tokyo, Japan's admirals and generals grew uneasy. Their entire defensive strategy, built around the assumption that every island must be fought for, was collapsing. Each time they prepared for a massive American invasion, the U.S. simply chose another target further up the chain. By the time Japan reacted, it was too late. Their garrisons were stranded, their airfields destroyed, their fleets scattered. The brilliance of America's island hopping wasn't just military, it was psychological. It turned Japan's vast empire into a liability. And it left their soldiers isolated, doomed to starve, forgotten by their own command. The Japanese were beginning to realize something terrifying. They were losing not just islands, they were losing the entire Pacific. By early 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had shifted, but not by chance. What the Japanese thought was a cautious American crawl across the ocean was in fact a calculated masterstroke of logistics, deception, and relentless forward momentum. The Japanese Empire had built hundreds of airfields and garrisons across its conquered islands, each one fortified with bunkers, tunnels, and artillery batteries. Their goal was simple: to make every inch of ground cost America thousands of lives. But the Americans didn't play by those rules anymore. Instead of attacking every stronghold head-on, they'd go around them, leapfrogging from island to island, cutting off supply lines, and leaving Japanese troops stranded to die of starvation or disease. And now, the next leap would prove how devastating this new strategy truly was. January 1944, Operation Flintlock. Target: the Marshall Islands, a string of coral atolls that guarded Japan's outer defensive perimeter. The Japanese expected the Americans to attack Jaluit or Mili, both heavily fortified. But U.S. intelligence had cracked Japanese communications again and discovered that two other atolls, Kwajalein and Majuro, were far more vulnerable. Admiral Chester Nimitz made the call: strike where they least expect it. At dawn, U.S. battleships and carriers unleashed one of the most intense bombardments in naval history up to that point. Kwajalein was pounded for 2 straight days. When the Marines finally landed, the Japanese defenders, who had been cut off from supplies and reinforcements, could barely fight back. It was over in just a few days. Compare that to Tarawa, fought only 2 months earlier, where over 1,000 Americans had died taking a single island. Now casualties were minimal. For the first time, Japanese commanders realized that their defenses, their so-called unsinkable fortresses, were being skipped, strangled, and neutralized before they could even fight. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff tried to make sense of what was happening. They still believed Japan could hold the inner defensive ring, the Marianas, Palau, and the Philippines. But the Americans were moving faster than anyone had thought possible. The U.S. Navy's massive logistics fleet, tankers, repair ships, mobile dry docks, kept the fleet supplied even thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor. While Japanese warships had to retreat to refuel, American carrier groups could stay at sea for weeks. One Japanese officer later admitted, "We fought against a nation that could build a floating city wherever it wished." It wasn't just technology. It was industrial willpower on display. By the time Japanese scouts spotted a U.S. task force, it was often too late. Islands were already under bombardment, airfields already destroyed, and communications already jammed. And then came the next leap, the one that shook the Japanese military to its core. Summer 1944. The U.S. Pacific Fleet set its sights on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Marianas Islands. Capturing them would put B-29 superfortresses within bombing range of Tokyo itself. To Japan, this was unthinkable. The Marianas were sacred ground, part of the homeland's outer defense barrier. The Japanese Navy mobilized what remained of its carrier strength for one massive counterattack, a gamble they called Operation A-Go. It would become known in the West as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19, 1944, waves of Japanese aircraft took off to strike the American fleet. They were met by hundreds of American fighters, F-6F Hellcats, waiting for them. Radar had given the Americans an early warning. When the Japanese came into range, the sky erupted. One by one, the attackers were shot down. The Hellcats' superior speed, firepower, and training decimated the enemy formations. By the end of the day, over 350 Japanese planes had been destroyed, at the cost of barely 30 American aircraft. It was so one-sided that U.S. pilots joked it was a turkey shoot. But for Japan's air arm, it was annihilation. Admiral Ozawa's carrier force had lost nearly all of its trained pilots. Japan could build more planes, but not more experience. From this point on, they would never again regain air superiority. While the naval battle raged offshore, U.S. Marines and Army troops stormed the beaches of Saipan. The fighting was brutal. Japanese defenders fought to the last man, often resorting to suicidal banzai charges. But no matter how fierce their resistance, the outcome was inevitable. On July 9, 1944, Saipan was declared secure. For the first time, the Japanese homeland was within direct striking distance of American bombers. Tokyo could no longer deny that the war was turning against them. When Emperor Hirohito received the news, it was said he was shocked into silence. Japan's Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, resigned days later, a rare political collapse in the empire's history. The psychological blow was devastating. The myth of Japanese invincibility, in both the air and the islands, was crumbling, but this was only the beginning. Because next, America would take its boldest leap yet toward the Philippines and the doorstep of Japan itself. And with that leap, the entire Japanese war machine would begin to unravel. By late 1944, America's island-hopping campaign had turned from an experiment into a juggernaut. The Japanese called it the dreaded leapfrog. Every time they fortified one island, the Americans simply skipped over it, isolating entire divisions that would never fire another shot. But the next target wasn't just another coral reef or atoll. It was a statement: the Philippines. For General Douglas MacArthur, it was personal. He had promised in 1942, when forced to evacuate from Corregidor, "I shall return." Now, that return would become one of the most pivotal and shocking chapters in the Pacific War. Japan's high command had predicted that America would strike next at Formosa, or the Ryukyus. Those were logical targets for an invasion on the way to Japan, but the Americans once again defied logic. MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz agreed on a bold strategy: bypass the heavily defended areas, strike where the Japanese least expected, and sever their command structure entirely. The target: Leyte, in the central Philippines. By landing there, they would split the Japanese Empire in two, cutting the forces in the south, trapped in the Dutch East Indies, from the homeland to the north. It was the ultimate manifestation of the island-hopping doctrine. Ignore the enemy's strongest points, attack their weakest links, and make their strength meaningless. The Japanese could not comprehend it. To them, not defending every inch of territory was dishonorable, unthinkable. But the Americans weren't fighting for honor. They were fighting to win. October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese Imperial Navy launched a desperate all-or-nothing counterattack. Their plan: lure Admiral Halsey's carriers north with a decoy fleet, while their main forces smashed into the vulnerable invasion beaches. But Japan underestimated American radar, reconnaissance, and communication. Even though Halsey's pursuit left parts of the landing force exposed, U.S. escort carriers, tiny jeep carriers with small aircraft complements, fought back ferociously. Off Samar, the destroyer USS Johnston and her crew charged a Japanese battleship group that outgunned them 10-1. Her commander, Ernest Evans, shouted to his men, "We're going in. We're going to attack. They're shooting at us anyway." In one of the most heroic naval actions of the war, American destroyers and aircraft inflicted heavy damage, confusing Japanese commanders and forcing them to retreat. By the end of the 4-day battle, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and over 10,000 men. It was the death of the Imperial Navy as an effective fighting force. The shockwaves of Leyte Gulf were felt throughout Japan. The navy that had once ruled the Pacific was now broken. As the Americans leapt from one island to the next, skipping entire garrisons, those left behind began to wither. Japanese soldiers stranded on bypassed islands like Truk, Rabaul, and Kavieng were now effectively prisoners, isolated, starving, and forgotten. Supplies never came. Ships that tried to reach them were sunk by American submarines or aircraft. By 1945, many of these isolated garrisons had resorted to eating roots, insects, even bark. U.S. intelligence estimates suggested over 100,000 Japanese troops were stranded, completely neutralized without a single direct battle. Island hopping wasn't just fast. It was efficient warfare at an industrial scale. Every bypassed island meant saved American lives and exhausted Japanese ones. But there was one island that couldn't be bypassed: Okinawa. Only 350 miles from Japan, it was the last stepping stone before the planned invasion of the home islands. The Japanese had learned from their earlier mistakes. This time, they built miles of underground tunnels, reinforced bunkers, and prepared to fight to the death. The battle began in April 1945. It was hell on earth. Rain turned the ground into rivers of mud. Artillery and flamethrowers turned hills into infernos. For the first time, the Japanese unleashed waves of kamikaze attacks, suicide planes diving directly into U.S. ships. Over 1,500 kamikazes would strike during the battle, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of sailors. But nothing could stop the American advance. After nearly 3 months of fighting, Okinawa fell in June 1945. The cost was staggering: more than 12,000 Americans dead, and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians lost. But strategically, the war was now on Japan's doorstep. The Americans had done it. In just 3 years, they had leapt nearly 4,000 miles across the Pacific, one island at a time, breaking the back of an empire that once seemed unstoppable. In Tokyo, disbelief turned into despair. Admirals who had once boasted of Japan's unsinkable island fortresses now faced reports of isolated garrisons begging for food. General Hideki Tojo's earlier words haunted the staff. "Our empire will stand unbroken for 1,000 years." But now, it wasn't standing at all. The airfields they had built were abandoned. The fleets they had launched were at the bottom of the ocean, and the army divisions they had trusted were starving on forgotten islands. For the first time, senior Japanese officers began to whisper the unthinkable. Japan could lose the war. The Americans had done more than conquer territory. They had conquered the Japanese way of thinking, replacing stubborn defense with mobility, strategy, and overwhelming logistics. But the final shock was still to come, a blow so devastating that no Japanese admiral or general could have ever imagined it. It would bring the Empire of Japan to its knees and end the Pacific War forever. By the summer of 1945, the American juggernaut had reached Japan's doorstep. The island-hopping campaign had done the impossible. It had dismantled the empire's outer defenses, crushed its navy, and brought American air power within striking distance of Tokyo itself. From the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima to the shattered ridges of Okinawa, every leap had been costly, but every victory brought America closer to the heart of Japan. For the Japanese high command, reality had become unbearable. Entire fleets were gone. Airfields lay in ruins. Cities were being erased from maps. And yet, there was no surrender. Japan's leaders still clung to the Bushido spirit, the ancient warrior code that demanded death before dishonor. They were preparing for the ultimate defense, the invasion of the home islands. As American generals met in Guam and Hawaii, a plan began to form. Its name was Operation Downfall, and it would have been the largest amphibious invasion in human history, even greater than D-Day. The plan called for nearly 5 million Allied troops, over 10,000 ships, and months of relentless air and naval bombardment. First, Operation Olympic would land on Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. Then, Operation Coronet would strike directly at Tokyo. But the numbers were terrifying. War planners estimated 1 to 1.5 million American casualties and potentially 10 million Japanese deaths. Soldiers, civilians, everyone. General George C. Marshall later said, "We were facing a nation that would die to the last man. We knew an invasion could destroy them, and us." And Japan was preparing exactly for that. While the Americans prepared their invasion fleets, the Japanese military began Ketsu-go, the decisive battle strategy. Every man, woman, and child was to fight. Schoolgirls were trained with bamboo spears. Civilians were ordered to build homemade explosives. Even old rifles from the Russo-Japanese War were distributed again. Japan had lost the ability to win, but it was ready to make losing as painful as possible. American intelligence, intercepting radio communications, was stunned. They realized that Japan wasn't planning to surrender. It was planning mass suicide. Something drastic, something unimaginable, would be needed to break that will. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. A single bomber, the Enola Gay, appeared in the sky. At 8:15 a.m., it released a bomb unlike any weapon ever used in war. The world changed in a flash. A fireball hotter than the sun engulfed the city. Within seconds, 80,000 people were dead. Within hours, Hiroshima was a smoldering wasteland. Japan's leaders were speechless. They didn't understand what had happened. They thought it was a massive chemical explosion until 3 days later. August 9, 1945, Nagasaki. The second atomic bomb erased another city, another 70,000 lives. For a military that had already been crippled by island hopping, this was the final, unanswerable blow. Japan had no more ships, no more planes, and now, no more hope. On August 15, 1945, the Japanese people gathered around their radios. For the first time in history, they heard the voice of their emperor. In a trembling tone, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, saying, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Should we continue to fight, it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization." The once mighty empire of Japan, which had sworn never to yield, had fallen. American soldiers who had fought through island after island wept openly. They realized they wouldn't have to invade Japan after all. They would finally go home. For millions of Japanese soldiers stranded on bypassed islands, the war was already long over. But now, officially, it was done.
When historians look back at the Pacific War, they see more than just a series of battles. They see a revolution in strategy. The island-hopping campaign proved that wars could be won through mobility, precision, and logistics, not just brute force. By selectively striking key islands and bypassing others, the U.S. military shattered an empire without fighting for every inch of ground.
It turned geography, once Japan's greatest strength, into its greatest weakness, and perhaps most importantly, it showed that innovation, courage, and adaptability could defeat even the most entrenched enemy. The island-hopping campaign didn't just win the Pacific War. It changed how the world thought about warfare. From Tarawa to Okinawa, it was a story of blood, sacrifice, and brilliance. A campaign that began as a desperate gamble became a blueprint for victory. And for the Japanese military, it was more than a defeat. It was a shock that shattered the illusion of invincibility. The Pacific was quiet once again, but its islands still whisper the echoes of that brutal, ingenious strategy. A strategy that leapt across oceans and ended a war. If you found this story as incredible as we did, the courage, the strategy, the sheer scale of it all, then make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of World War II. This was WWW2 Valor Echoes. Until next time, remember the men who fought and the lessons history never lets us forget. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific looked nothing like it had 4 years earlier. Once brilliant atolls lay scarred and cratered. Entire islands, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, were graveyards of men and machines. The empire that once dreamed of dominating Asia had been reduced to ashes, its cities flattened, its fleets rusting beneath the sea. In Tokyo, American occupation forces marched through the ruins of what had once been the heart of imperial power. For the Japanese people, defeat was not just military, it was spiritual. For the first time in centuries, Japan had been conquered. And the Americans who walked through the shattered remnants of airfields and bunkers saw the aftermath of their island-hopping strategy firsthand, how every leap, every bypassed garrison had drained the life out of an empire that once stretched across thousands of miles. Victory had come at a terrible price. Over 100,000 Americans had died across the Pacific, from the beaches of Tarawa to the ridges of Peleliu and the jungles of Guadalcanal. Japanese losses were even more staggering, millions, military and civilian alike. On many islands, small groups of Japanese soldiers refused to believe the war was over. Some hid in caves or jungles, surviving off roots and rainwater, convinced that surrender was impossible. One of the most famous was Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, who held out in the Philippines until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended. He once said, "We were taught that to surrender was the greatest shame. We never imagined Japan could lose." The same mindset that had driven Japan's soldiers to fight so fiercely was the same one that made surrender and acceptance almost unthinkable. But here's the shocking twist that few could have predicted in 1945. The nation that had been crushed by the island-hopping campaign would go on to study and adopt many of the very principles that defeated it. After the war, American generals, including Douglas MacArthur, oversaw Japan's reconstruction. Instead of revenge, the United States helped rebuild the country's economy, industry, and even its education system. The result? Within just 2 decades, Japan transformed from a shattered empire into a technological powerhouse, a peaceful democracy that embraced innovation instead of militarism. And in a twist of history's irony, the same meticulous planning, logistics, and engineering that once fueled its war machine now powered the rise of companies like Toyota, Sony, and Mitsubishi, brands that would later dominate global markets. The very discipline and attention to detail that defined Japan's wartime spirit became the foundation of its post-war success. Meanwhile, military historians across the world began studying America's island-hopping campaign with awe. It became a textbook example of strategic innovation, showing how control of key geographic points could collapse an entire defensive network. Future generations of commanders in Korea, Vietnam, and even modern naval operations would study how the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps coordinated logistics, intelligence, and amphibious warfare on such an unprecedented scale. Even Japan's own post-war military thinkers quietly acknowledged it. One former Imperial Navy officer later wrote, "It was not the might of America that defeated us, but their understanding of the ocean." The island-hopping strategy proved that geography was not just a barrier, it was a weapon. For the men who fought across the Pacific, the scars never truly healed. Many had left parts of themselves on distant islands whose names most people would never remember: Saipan, Eniwetok, Peleliu, Tinian. But their sacrifices, and the strategy that guided them, shaped the modern world. Families back home welcomed their sons with tears and pride. And for many veterans, the sight of Japan's surrender wasn't just the end of a war. It was the proof that perseverance, intelligence, and unity could overcome even the fiercest enemy. As one Marine veteran later said, "We didn't just take islands. We took back the future." Visual cue. Archival footage of calm Pacific seas fading into black and white photos of smiling soldiers returning home. The island-hopping campaign began as an untested gamble, an idea that many thought would fail. Yet it ended the most brutal war the Pacific had ever seen and changed the course of human history. It was a campaign of innovation born out of desperation, a story of courage written on sands that still whisper of the men who never returned. And ultimately, it was a lesson that even in the darkest chapters of war, strategy and sacrifice can illuminate the path to peace. The island-hopping strategy wasn't just about defeating Japan. It was about redefining how wars are fought and how peace is won. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the courage, strategy, and human cost that shaped our world, then don't let these voices fade. Subscribe to WW2 Valor Echoes and join us as we uncover more untold stories, declassified secrets, and forgotten heroes from the Second World War. Because history isn't just about what happened. It is about what it taught us. This is WW2 Valor Echoes. Remember the past to protect the future.